I'm Jack Monsted. I'm the Assistant Curator for the Native Plant Trail here at Blandy Experimental Farm and the State Arboretum of Virginia. The Native Plant Trail is a section of the Arboretum. It spans about 30 acres, and its purpose is to focus on native plants, native wildflowers, and sort of educating people, preserving and educating people on the native plants here in Virginia. There's 3 sections to the trail that we'll be seeing today. The first is the woodland section, which you can see behind me. A lot of great trees, native wildflowers, and any shade-adapted species. Then there is a very large meadow section, which is about 25 acres of it. And the meadow section features a lot of warm season grasses and big wide open meadow spaces. And the last area is a wetland area, which features a lot of our aquatic plants. Now the Native Plant Trail is actually known as the Nancy Larritt Crosby Native Plant Trail because it was started with a generous donation from Nancy Larritt Crosby, who was a local native plant lover and wildflower enthusiast who gave a generous donation to start the trail. And so we built it in the early 90s, and it's kind of been progressing and growing ever since then as we plant new things and kind of work to shepherd a very diverse and interesting collection of our native species on the trail. So without further ado, we'll take a walk in and I'll show you the woodland section, and we'll start to look at some of the cool plants in the Native Plant Trail. So now we're in the woodland section of the Native Plant Trail. This is one of my favorite sections. It's really nice and wooded. There's obviously trees everywhere. And the purpose of this section is to kind of mimic one of the native woodlands in Virginia. So Virginia, prior to European settlement, it was very heavily forested. So there's a lot of forests and there's a lot of really cool native plants that are endemic to Virginia that we really try to showcase in the woodland here. So I guess since we're in the woodland, the first thing to start with is the trees and the big woody stuff, because that's kind of the interesting component here. So to my left here, you can see this is a Carolina allspice bush. This is also known as Calycanthus florida. It's a really cool native shrub. You can see it's actually flowering right now. It's kind of towards the end of its flowering cycle, but it has these really interesting red flower pods on them, and they kind of have a nice savory smell. So this is a really interesting bush, and it does really well in any sort of rocky, sort of dry habitats, and it spreads really well and looks really nice pretty much all year round. It's a really good bush. We have several of them throughout the Native Plant Trail here, and it's always one of our favorites right around this time of year. For reference, we're shooting this towards the end of May, so we're just getting some of the late spring stuff and some of the early summer stuff that's starting to flower. Behind me here, you'll also see another really interesting tree. This white tree with all the nice white flowers is called a fringe tree. That's Chionanthus virginicus. And this is a tree that doesn't get a lot of attention. A lot of people don't even know about it or don't even know what the tree is, but it is native to Virginia. And it's a nice tree. It's a smaller tree. It only gets to be about 20 feet tall, which makes it really good for any sort of planting. If you have limited space in a yard or something, you just want a nice mid-sized tree. The fringe tree is really nice. They have white flowers all throughout late spring and early summer. And they're dioecious, which means that there are separate male and female trees. They both produce flowers, so you don't have to worry about that. But if you have a female tree, you'll get some nice berries at the end of the year also. Another tree that is one of our favorites is right next to me here. This is a redbud tree. So you can see it's got these interesting heart-shaped leaves on it. This one is just leafed out. The redbuds, if we had been here maybe a month or 2 ago, the tree would be covered in bright pink flowers. Redbud trees are kind of a local favorite for that reason. They just have these really nice spring flowers, and when you see redbuds blooming, you know it's the start of spring. And we have a lot of them in the Native Plant Trail here. Actually, we almost have too many redbuds in the Native Plant Trail here in the woodland. We spend a lot of time in the summer and fall after the seeds have come down, picking out little redbud trees that we'll be trying to start everywhere. Otherwise, we'd have just redbuds covering the entire Native Plant Trail, which would be kind of interesting. So yeah, these are some of the great trees on this section of the Native Plant Trail. And next, I want to go over and talk about maybe some more trees and some interesting wildflowers farther down the trail. So here I would like to talk about some of the herbaceous, some of the smaller herbaceous plants that we have along the Native Plant Trail. So in the forests, the understory, the herb layer is actually, in the forests of Virginia, is actually the most diverse layer plant-wise in the entire forest. So while there's about 10 species of herbs for every single species of tree. So the vast majority of the biodiversity in our forests is made up in the herb layer. And that's reflected here. So you can see right down here beside me, there is a really nice eastern blue star. This is Amsonia tabernae-montana. And this plant is actually a really nice plant. Flowers right now in late spring, early summer, and it does really well in part shade, in full shade, in sun. It's a pretty adaptable plant, and it requires very little watering once you put in. So these ones were actually planted, I believe, 2 years ago, and this is the very first year they flowered. So we're pretty excited about that. This also brings up kind of a good point about sort of how we like to plant things and how our philosophy guiding all the actions that we take here on the Native Plant Trail. So as you probably noticed, if you're looking out back here, there's a lot of things growing on the ground. You know, we've got a lot of little herbs, a lot of little green things growing kind of everywhere and even between all of our big plantings. And that's because one of the guiding philosophies for this is to kind of work with nature. You know, in a traditional gardening setting, what you want to do is you want to weed everything, clear everything out down to bare ground and put in flowers and then put a lot of effort into keeping everything under control in that way. Here while we do a lot of planting and we do a lot of weeding, as any of our volunteers will tell you, we like to leave a lot of the things that are native and a lot of the things that will sort of intermesh with the landscape and kind of allow them to go to seed and spread, so that way creates less weeding for all the really bad stuff that we have to deal with later on. So I can kind of showcase that over here on this side of the trail. Over here we kind of have a mixed planting, and so this is a planting that our volunteers did last year, and it's just getting started now, so this will fill out a lot more as the summer progresses. But you've got a variety of different plants kind of intermixed among each other, and we only weed out the stuff that we really don't want. So here we have some wild ginger. This is Asarum canadense. This is a really lovely little plant. Its roots actually smell like ginger, and it kind of has these really nice little purple flowers in early spring. And because we're so good with letting this flower and letting this go to seed, it actually free seeds itself around, and you'll find other plants that look like this throughout the trail if you look closely. We also have things like this little sensitive fern here, which you can also see back here. And that's a really nice native fern, which likes a lot of water, so we're planting it in this kind of lower wet area that's beneath this wall, so the water runs down into these beds. And you have things like Jacob's Ladder here, which this one's very small and very young. But that too will spread itself out. So when you're looking at these, you kind of get the idea of what it would feel like to walk through a very rich, old-growth forest here in Virginia. We try to mimic the sort of natural, the natural lay of plants, while still focusing on, highlighting a few of the really cool ones that we want to show off, like we did over there with the Eastern Blue Star. So here we are now in the, just in front of the meadow section of the Native Plant Trail. So we just emerged out of the woodland section and we're heading into the meadow, which you can see directly behind me. This is in the center of the Arboretum, roughly. The woodland section where we just were is just south of the quarters, and then as you continue to go south from there, you end up out here in the meadow. So this is right in the middle of the Arboretum, and you'll see a lot of the Arboretum collections of the nice trees and things going around the outside of the Native Plant Trail. But here in the meadow, this is a bit more of a wild ecosystem. So this meadow was established again back in the early 2000s. And when it was first established, it was established actually as a research meadow. So for a lot of UVA's research efforts, a lot of their environmental studies students come out here and do research projects here all throughout the summer most of the year. And those research projects are mostly looking at native plants and wildlife and things like that. So this whole section is actually managed it's a very large area. It's about 25 acres. And it's managed mostly for wildlife and for native plants. So this is not going to be, it's not necessarily a nice, well-kept garden. It's more of a wild area where you're showcasing a lot of really interesting plants, and those plants provide home to a lot of really interesting animals and insects and all sorts of things. So there's a lot of really fascinating ecological connections out here, which I'm excited to show you guys all about. So here we are in the middle of the meadow section right now, and you can see behind me, you see a sea of grasses, and this is essentially what a meadow looks like in late spring. So all these grasses that we have here, you can see they're mostly brown and dead. That's because these are actually last year's stems. these are all warm season grasses. So most of our native grasses here in Virginia are grasses that actually only grow during the hottest summer months. So most of their growth is done during June, July, and August, and then they flower in September, and then they go away in the fall. So a lot of the stuff for this year is just getting started and is very small, but you can see how tall some of these grasses get. So this one right next to me here, I believe, is Big Blue Stem. And you can see I'm about 6'2" for reference, and this is just a little bit taller than me. So these grasses can get very, very tall. If you come back here sometime in like early fall, you'll see a beautiful tall field of these nice golden grasses, and they just look really great swaying in the breeze. And so most of these tall grasses are either big blue stem or Indian grass or switchgrass, all three of which are just very tall statured native grasses. And these grasses also, when they grow, they kind of make this clumping habit. So it makes them actually surprisingly good for planting even in a smaller planting, like at a house or something, because you can plant a clump of these grasses and then they will just gradually spread outward if you let them, but they won't just run all over the place. And this clumping habit makes them really, really good for wildlife. So birds and small mammals and stuff really like they need that space between the grasses, between the clumps of grasses to move around and go about their lives. So you'll see a lot of birds and a lot of small mammals, rabbits, field mice, all kind of running around through the grasses here. Another very common sight you'll see here are deer. Deer love to bed down in this area. We have a very, very large number of white-tailed deer here at Blandy. The deer is actually kind of interesting because we all really love to see the deer, and we love to see them walking around out here. But they actually make my job as an assistant curator sometimes a lot harder, especially over in the woodland where we just were. Because they'll come in and they'll just eat everything. So a lot of the biggest challenges that I see, especially when I'm trying to plant small herbs and things in the woodland, those things are like candy to deer. So the deer will come through and eat a whole bunch. So we're oftentimes trying to put out deer deterrents and things to keep them away from our plantings while allowing them to thrive and live out here in the meadow where the habitat is sort of built to support them. So next we'll talk about some of the management that we do in the meadow a little bit later. So because the meadow is such a really big area, like I said, it's over 20 acres, we have to manage it a little bit different than we would in the woodland. In the woodland, our primary management is volunteers. We have a dedicated crew of really great volunteers who come out every week and they help weed, they help plant things, we do a lot of hand weeding, things like that. Out here in the meadow, because it's such a big area, that's not really an option. We can't go out and hand weed because there's just too much space. So we employ a couple of different methods to sort of manage the meadow and guide it towards the kind of biodiversity and to guide it towards the interesting kind of plants that we want. One of those methods is fire. So if the meadow was completely unmanaged, if we didn't do anything, it would turn back into a forest. Trees would come, the trees would get really large, and it would become a forest, within 20 or 30 years. You'd start to see big trees everywhere, and they would go from there. But because we disturb it all the time with things such as fire and mowing, it keeps it in a nice open structure and allows the grasses and wildflowers to thrive. So behind me, this is actually a field that was burned 2 months ago. So we do an annual burn here. And we burn 1/3 of the meadow every year. So each spring we'll burn a different third of the meadow and we'll just cycle through that way. So each section only goes 3 years between burns at the longest. And this area was burned 2 months ago. If you were to come back here in March, right after the burn, everything was black. The ground was just pure soot and ash. Everything had been totally burned away. And as you can see already, it's really starting to green up and it's really starting to look really lush. And we're seeing the consequences of that in the plant community right away. So you can see a lot of these dead sticks that seem to be poking up out of the ground. Those are actually an invasive blackberry. They get really, really tall, and it is a blackberry and it produces tasty berries, so we all like that. But they do tend to spread and get a little bit out of control out here. So what the burn does is it actually burnt them all down, charred all the stems, burnt them down, and then now you can see a lot of the grasses, a lot of the warm season grasses that we just talked about are really starting to come up in there. So they're all very short right now, but in a few months they'll be nice and tall and they'll be able to provide habitat to a lot of wildlife. Some of the blackberries will come back as well, which is fine. The birds like to eat the berries and that's always a good thing. But the burn really does shift the favor of the meadow towards those grasses, which is really what we wanted to encourage with this burn. Some of our other management practices include we bush hog, which is basically a giant mower that can even mow down small trees. So sometimes when the trees don't get hit by the burn too much, we'll run a bush hog down and we'll cut those down. You can see if you look farther outfield, you can see some things that look like kind of scrubby brown bits out there. So those are actually trees. We had a big patch of black locust trees out there that had gotten quite tall. And just this last year, we cut them all down and we just left them out there. Now, you might think that, oh, just leaving trees out in the meadow is probably, you know, it's not very attractive or something like that. But actually, we do it for a good reason. So the piles of dead trees, like the brush that builds up there, again, provides really good habitat for homes for little mice and things that need that cover to avoid any hawks and predators and things that might come towards them. So it provides really good habitat, and plus in a few months, once the grasses get tall, you won't even be able to see them from the outside. So that's a little bit about how we manage the meadow. It's a really fascinating ecosystem to be a part of, and we're always learning new things about it as our undergraduate and graduate students from UVA are doing a lot of research out here. So now we'll walk down a little bit more and we'll go see what's going on in the wetland. So this is the wetland area. Right now we're on the boardwalk, which goes right through the edge of Rattlesnake Pond, which is our only kind of more permanent wetland here at Blandy. So the wetlands at Blandy are kind of interesting. They're a little bit seasonal, they're a little bit ephemeral, so a lot of them don't stay all year round unless we've had a lot of rainfall, in which case the wetlands will fill up. And then if we have in a drought, most of them will dry out except for a very small pond farther back that way into the wetlands. And so that really influences what kind of plants show up here too. Right now we do have a pretty interesting spread of plants and a lot of cool wetland plants to talk about. So this right here is the native elderberry. So this is Sambucus canadensis. Right now it's just in its foliage stage, but in probably a month or two here, it'll start to flower and then it will produce a whole nice batch of elderberries. So if you've ever had elderberries, it's a nice edible berry. It's been used historically to make a lot of wines. You can use it in pies, baking, all sorts of interesting things. So this is a really cool native plant, and we have those kind of all throughout the wetland down here. We also have some silky dogwoods. So over here, these leaves with the nice twin leaves, that's a silky dogwood. And they are wetland shrubs, and we planted those probably 15 or 20 years ago, and they've become really well established along here. So again, those also in probably a month or two will be flowering really nice here. Behind me here, this is a bare bush right here. This is a button bush. It's not flowering right now. But again, give it some time and they produce these really interesting circular white flowers, like spherical flowers. And they're all along here and the birds just love them, love their seeds that they produce. So one interesting thing about this wetland this year in particular is that we had a really, really cold spring. So it was really warm in March, and then April and the beginning of May were all very, very cold. So that's why you're seeing so little green on these bushes here. These wetland plants are really, they respond very heavily to seasons and moisture level changes and things like that. And so while normally you might be seeing some of these plants flowering by now on any other year when the spring is a little bit warmer, because we've had this really cold spring, they're just getting started. So this will be a really exciting place probably in another month or so. This down here beside me, this is a tall yellow iris. So the yellow iris is actually kind of the bane of the wetland here. So it produces really beautiful yellow flowers, and for that reason it is sold commonly as a landscape plant, and a lot of people like to plant it in their landscapes. But the problem is once it gets established, it is very aggressive, it spreads very fast, and it's very hard to remove. It is not a native plant. It was introduced here, I believe, from Europe, and it produces these really, really thick rhizomes, probably 4 inches thick, underground, so it's almost impossible to pull them out. Pretty much the only way you can control them is either by using herbicide on them, which is obviously not something we try to do in a wetland area, or by just cutting them over and over again year after year, which is a very labor-intensive process. So we are in the act of trying to control some of the yellow iris. We have a lot of it throughout the wetland, but some of our volunteers that have worked here in the past really do a lot of really good work out here. So usually once or twice a year at least, we'll all come out here and we'll get our waders on, we'll go out into the wetland and we'll just start cutting back the irises as much as we can. And then we hope that over a long period of time, we'll eventually start to thin those out, and some native plants will be able to come in where they used to be. But yeah, other than that, the wetland is just, it's a really favorite place for bird watchers as well. The birds really love the wet, a lot of birds require sort of wet habitat. And so, I mean, even if you just listen around us here, you'll hear a lot of different birds. And it's really nice to come and see hawks, herons, red-winged blackbirds. We have a nice patch of purple martins that come in every year. A lot of really interesting birds down here, as well as turtles and amphibians, obviously. So yeah, this is the boardwalk in the wetland, and I'll go and show you a few more plants a little farther down the way. So here we are in an area right next to Rattlesnake Spring. So Rattlesnake Spring is actually the rock there's an underground aquifer that emerges from these rock outcroppings here around me and feeds into this pond. And this is the only real permanent year-round wetland at Blandy that never really dries up except for in years of extreme drought. So this is standing water pretty much year-round. And this area is kind of interesting because up until last year, this whole area that I'm standing in right now was entirely covered by invasive buckthorn trees. So these buckthorn trees were probably 15 feet tall, and they just completely crowded everything else out from growing here. So last year, myself and some volunteers came out and we dug up and removed a lot of the buckthorn trees, and we started to replant with some native plants, and we've seen some native plants just move in on their own, which is really kind of exciting. So if you look around behind me here, you see kind of a variety of different plants, and they're all pretty small right now and they're not flowering, but in another month or two, you'll see a lot of really interesting flowers coming up here, and it'll be a really cool place to visit. So you can see back here we have some of our native goldenrod right here, which has spread, and that kind of came back naturally. I didn't plant any of those. We also have some great blue lobelia and some cardinal flower, which I did plant, and they're small rosettes right now, but in a few months they will be flowering. There's some marsh marigolds, and there's a lot of this jewelweed. So jewelweed is this plant right here, and it will produce really beautiful orange flowers come later in the fall. And that jewelweed actually spread in all by itself, and it's kind of taken over a big portion here. So we'll have a really nice, beautiful bloom of jewelweed in the fall. Jewelweed is a really interesting plant because it's actually very much a favorite of hummingbirds. So if you come down here in the fall, you will almost inevitably see hummingbirds buzzing from flower to flower, sipping on the nectar, as well as native bumblebees and a lot of other really interesting insects all feeding on these flowers. So even though it doesn't look like much now, in a few months these flowers are going to be really great habitat for a lot of interesting insects and birds and wildlife and all kinds of other things like that. Out behind me here you can see we have some dead willow stumps here. So this was a willow tree, and it died several years ago, but we leave the stumps there because it's actually also very good habitat. A lot of birds like to nest in there, and some like to make nests in the cavities as well. Out beyond that, you can see some cattails. So the cattails are a native plant, and they're a very interesting plant. They do tend to spread pretty aggressively, so that's another thing that we're working on controlling. In addition to the yellow irises that you can see out there, the cattails also do get pretty dense. And they're fine taking over some areas, but we do cut those back a little bit as well. It's just one of our management techniques that we do down here in the wetland. All right, so that's been our tour of the native plant trail. Thank you all for joining us. I hope you found it very interesting. So if you want to learn a little bit more about Blandy or the State Arboretum, you can visit our website at blandy.virginia.edu. And if you'd like to support us, you can feel free to donate to the Foundation of the State Arboretum on our website. So thanks so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you back here at Blandy in Boyce, Virginia, as soon as we reopen, as soon as we're able to see you. Thanks.